The Black Hawk War of 1832 serves as a definitive chapter in the history of the American frontier, a conflict characterized not by grand set-piece battles of European tradition, but by a chaotic series of skirmishes, raids, and profound misunderstandings that illuminated the incompatibility of settler expansionism and indigenous sovereignty. Within this broader theater of violence, the massacre of United States Indian agent Felix St. Vrain and his companions on May 24, 1832, stands as a singularly grim event. It was not merely a military engagement, it was a catastrophic failure of diplomacy, a betrayal of fictive kinship, and a brutal manifestation of the fog of war that descended upon the Illinois and Michigan territories. To fully comprehend the gravity of the St. Vrain massacre, one must look beyond the immediate violence to the complex geopolitical and psychological landscape of the era. The spring of 1832 saw the Illinois frontier in a state of near hysteria. The British band of Sauk and Fox Indians, led by the intransigent warrior Black Hawk, Makatai Meshikiakiak, had crossed the Mississippi River in an attempt to reclaim ancestral lands near Saukenuk. This movement, ostensibly a migration to reclaim lost territory disputed under the Treaty of 1804, was interpreted by American authorities and settlers as an invasion. The psychological atmosphere among the white settlers was one of sheer terror, often detached from the actual strategic reality. Historical records indicate that rumors, no matter how impossible or ridiculous, were sufficient to throw a community into a panic. This phenomenon is best exemplified by the Westerfield scare in Fulton County, where the entire population fled into improvised fortifications based on unsubstantiated reports of impending attack. In such a climate, the line between civilian and combatant blurred, and the institutions designed to maintain peace, specifically the Office of Indian Affairs, found themselves thrust into the vanguard of the conflict. The massacre at Kellogg's Grove, therefore, was not an isolated incident of banditry, but a convergence of failing systems, the failure of the United States to secure the safety of its agents, the fracture of tribal leadership structures among the Ho-Chunk and Sauk, and the disintegration of the personal relationships that historically managed the middle ground between cultures. The central figure of this tragedy, Felix St. Vrain, was a man whose pedigree seemed ill-suited for the brutal realities of the 1832 frontier, yet whose family history was inextricably linked to the colonial expansion of North America. Born Felix Auguste Antoine de Ault de la Suze St. Vrain in Spanish Lake, St. Louis County, Missouri, he was the product of displaced French aristocracy. His grandfather, Marquis Pierre-Charles de Ault de la Suze de Louzière, had been a Knight of the Grand Cross of the Royal Order of St. Michael, a title that carried immense prestige in the Ancien Regime of France. The family had fled the violence of the French Revolution, arriving in North America in 1790, bringing with them the cultural affectations of the French court to the muddy banks of the Mississippi. Felix's father, Jacques Marcelin Serran de Ault de la Suze de St. Vrain, had served as a commander in the French Navy before the Revolution, captaining the warship La Flèche, or the Arrow. This genealogical context is vital for understanding Felix St. Vrain's position. He was not a rough-hewn frontiersman like the militia leaders who would eventually bury him. He was a man of education and status, connected by blood to the commercial and political elite of St. Louis. His brother, Serran St. Vrain, was already establishing himself as a legendary figure in the fur trade, partnering with the Bent brothers to forge a commercial empire in the chaotic Southwest. Felix, however, chose the path of government service. Felix St. Vrain was appointed as the United States Indian agent for the Sauk and Fox tribes, roughly a year prior to the outbreak of the war, superseding the veteran agent Thomas Forsyth. The dismissal of Forsyth and the appointment of St. Vrain is often cited by historians as a destabilizing factor. While St. Vrain was described as a staunch friend of the Indian, he lacked the decades of deep experiential knowledge that Forsyth possessed. Critics and historians alike have noted that St. Vrain, despite his noble intentions, may have secured his position primarily through family political ties rather than practical experience in indigenous diplomacy. The role of an Indian agent in the 1830s was paradoxically powerless. They were the face of a federal government that was actively dispossessing their charges of land, yet they were expected to maintain peace and trust. St. Vrain attempted to bridge this gap through personal connection. He cultivated a relationship with a Sauk leader known as the Little Bear, going so far as to be adopted by the chief as a brother. In indigenous diplomatic traditions, particularly among the Great Lakes tribes, adoption was a binding socio-political contract intended to replace lost kin or cement alliances. St. Vrain likely viewed this adoption as a guarantee of safety, a diplomatic immunity that would transcend the brewing hostilities. As the events of May 24 would prove, this was a fatal miscalculation of the fluidity of tribal allegiances during wartime. By late May 1832, the region between Dixon's Ferry and Galena had become a no-man's land. General Henry Atkinson, commanding the U.S. forces, required a secure line of communication to Fort Armstrong on Rock Island. Despite the palpable danger, he ordered Felix St. Vrain to carry dispatches to the fort. St. Vrain did not travel alone. His party was a motley collection of men who represented the civilian-militia hybridity of the conflict. They were not professional soldiers, but settlers and merchants caught in the gears of war. The presence of Hawley, Kenny, Floyd, and Higginbotham was coincidental to St. Vrain's mission to Galena. These men had been in Sangamon County purchasing cattle when news of Black Hawk's incursion reached them. Abandoning their commercial project, they sought safety in numbers, attaching themselves to the Indian agent's party in the hope that his federal status and knowledge of the tribes would offer protection on the road to Galena. The psychological state of St. Vrain's party was already deteriorating days before the final encounter. On May 22, 1832, the group departed Dixon's Ferry, heading north. Upon reaching Buffalo Grove, they stumbled upon the aftermath of a previous violence, the body of William Durley. Durley had been killed on May 19th in what is now known as the Buffalo Grove ambush. He was part of a 6-man detail carrying dispatches from Colonel James M. Strode. Finding Durley's corpse lying in the open was a visceral confirmation that the roads were controlled by hostile bands. The St. Vrain party, shaken by the discovery, initially retreated to Dixon's Ferry to report the find. However, the exigencies of war overruled their caution. General Atkinson, prioritizing the communication lines to Fort Armstrong, ordered St. Vrain to proceed despite the intelligence regarding Durley. The party returned to Buffalo Grove, performed the grim duty of burying Durley's remains, and then pushed northward. They camped on the night of May 23rd, just 10 miles short of Fort Hamilton, dangerously exposed in the open terrain. This sequence of events, the discovery of a body, the retreat, the forced return, illustrates the immense pressure placed on St. Vrain by his military superiors, forcing him into a corridor known to be active with hostile forces. On the morning of May 24, 1832, near the location of present-day Pearl City, Illinois, in the vicinity of Kellogg's Grove, the party broke camp and traveled approximately 3 miles before pausing for breakfast. It was during this mundane act of eating that they were intercepted. A band of approximately 30 warriors appeared. The identification of these warriors is a subject of significant historical importance. While the war was named for Black Hawk Athok Band, consensus among historians and primary sources indicate that this specific war party was composed of Ho-Chunk or Winnebago warriors. The Ho-Chunk Nation occupied a complex position in the war, while officially neutral or even allied with the U.S. in some capacities. Independent bands within the tribe sympathized with the Sauk cause or utilized the chaos of the war to settle their own grievances. The tragedy of the St. Vrain massacre pivots on a single moment of recognition. Felix St. Vrain identified the leader of the war party as the Little Bear, the very chief who had previously adopted him as a brother. In the Sauk and Fox social structure, as well as the closely related Ho-Chunk traditions, leadership and lineage were often organized around clan totems, or phratries. The Bear clan held significant status, often associated with village leadership or war functions, depending on the specific tribal structure. St. Vrain, relying on the cultural sanctity of his adoption, misinterpreted the warrior's intentions. Sources describe St. Vrain approaching the Ho-Chunk with an outstretched hand, a universal gesture of peace and recognition. He believed that the bond of fictive kinship would supersede the state of war. However, the Ho-Chunk response was immediate and hostile. The Little Bear and his warriors ignored the gesture, signaling their intent to kill. St. Vrain attempted to plead for the lives of his companions, but the diplomatic channel had utterly collapsed. This interaction highlights a critical failure in cross-cultural interpretation. To St. Vrain, the adoption was a permanent status. To the warrior band, perhaps radicalized by the conflict or viewing St. Vrain's association with the invading army as a nullification of his status, he was simply an enemy. The betrayal was total. The killing of Felix St. Vrain was not merely a tactical neutralization of an enemy. It was a performative act of extreme violence. The condition of the bodies, specifically St. Vrain's, shocked the American public and hardened the military resolve against the tribes. General George Wallace Jones, St. Vrain's brother-in-law, who would later identify the body, provided a graphic account of the aftermath. The warriors had not only scalped the dead, a standard practice of trophy-taking in frontier warfare employed by both sides, but had engaged in systematic mutilation of the Indian agent. St. Vrain's head, hands, and feet were severed from his body. The most chilling detail, repeated across multiple primary accounts, was the removal of his heart. Sources state that the warriors cut out St. Vrain's heart and passed pieces of it around to be eaten by the braves. This act of ritual cannibalism demands nuanced anthropological interpretation. In the context of 19th century settler narratives, this was presented as evidence of irredeemable savagery, a silly Westerfield scare come to life. However, within the martial cultures of the Great Lakes tribes, consuming the heart of an enemy was often an act of profound respect and power accumulation. It was believed that one could absorb the courage and spirit of a brave adversary. The fact that the Little Bear oversaw this ritual suggests a complex psychological undercurrent. St. Vrain was not treated as a common enemy. He was treated as a figure of power. The consumption of his heart may have been a way to reclaim the power he held as an agent, or perhaps to ritually negate the power of the United States he represented. Alternatively, some sources suggest the mutilation began before St. Vrain was dead, adding a layer of torture that implies deep-seated rage or a specific grievance against the agent. Amidst the slaughter, 3 men accomplished a miraculous escape. Thomas Kenny, Aquila Floyd, and Alexander Higginbotham managed to break contact with the pursuing warriors. Their escape was not immediate. They were forced into a harrowing evasion through the hostile terrain of the driftless area. The survivors were pursued for miles. At one point, near Brush Creek, they were intercepted by yet another band of Indians, forcing them to abandon their horses or change direction. Their escape strategy relied on moving exclusively at night and hiding in the dense underbrush during daylight hours to avoid the patrols of Sauk and Ho-Chunk warriors scouring the countryside. After 3 days of evasion, the three men arrived safely in Galena, Illinois. Their arrival brought the first confirmed news of the massacre to the settlements, confirming the fears that the route to Dixon was impassable. There exists a significant historical discrepancy regarding Aquila Floyd. While he is listed as a survivor in the primary narratives and arrived in Galena, the monument erected at Kellogg's Grove in 1886 lists him as one of the fallen. This error has persisted in some local histories. Modern research into military and pension records clarifies this timeline. Aquila Floyd was discharged from the militia on August 20, 1832, months after the massacre, and returned to Kentucky. He lived for another 59 years, dying in Edmonson County, Kentucky, in November 1879. The inclusion of his name on the grave marker is a testament to the fog of war extending into historical memory. Because he returned to Kentucky and did not settle in the immediate area, locals likely assumed he had perished or conflated his presence at the battle with the casualties. The recovery of the bodies fell to Colonel Henry Dodge, a pragmatic and aggressive militia leader who would later become the first territorial governor of Wisconsin. Dodge's detachment, which included General George Wallace Jones, arrived at the scene to perform the burials. The mutilation of Felix St. Vrain rendered him unrecognizable by facial features. General Jones was forced to identify his brother-in-law through secondary means. He recognized the dress coat St. Vrain had been wearing and a pocketbook containing papers and money that the warriors had curiously left behind or discarded. Jones recovered the bloody coat and the pouch, artifacts that were returned to the St. Vrain family. These items remained in the possession of the Gregoire family, the family of St. Vrain's widow, for generations, serving as grim heirlooms of the event. The St. Vrain massacre had a catalytic effect on the American war effort. The killing of an Indian agent was viewed as an attack on the sovereignty of the federal government itself. Furthermore, the details of the heart-eating ritual circulated rapidly through the press and the militia camps, stripping away any remaining empathy for the Indian cause. The massacre contributed to the shift in U.S. tactics from containment to annihilation. Following late May, the conflict became increasingly brutal, culminating in the massacre of the Sauk at Bad Axe in August, where attempting to surrender was no longer a guarantee of safety, a policy likely influenced by the earlier betrayal of St. Vrain's flag of truce, or handshake. The federal government recognized the extraordinary nature of St. Vrain's death. In 1834, Congress passed a relief bill for his widow, Marie Pauline, or Mary Gregoire St. Vrain. The bill provided financial aid and a substantial land grant of 640 acres in Missouri. This legislative act was an implicit admission that the government had failed in its duty to protect its agent, acknowledging that St. Vrain had died in the line of duty under exceptional circumstances. The death of Felix St. Vrain signifies the end of the middle ground in the Illinois country. For decades, French-descended traders and agents like the St. Vrains, Chouteaus, and Gratios had managed relations with indigenous tribes through a blend of commerce, intermarriage, and cultural accommodation. They operated in a world where a handshake and an adoption ceremony held real diplomatic weight. The Black Hawk War, however, introduced a new dynamic, the raw agrarian expansionism of the Anglo-American settler and the rigid military hierarchy of the U.S. Army. In this new world, the nuanced relations of the French frontier brokers were obsolete. The little bear did not see a brother in Felix St. Vrain. He saw a white man carrying dispatches for General Atkinson. The massacre was therefore more than a tragic loss of life. It was the violent collision of two incompatible systems of meaning. St. Vrain died believing in the old system of kinship diplomacy. He was killed by a system of total war that had no place for such subtleties. His mutilated body, bereft of its heart, became a grisly symbol of the death of the diplomatic era and the birth of a policy of unyielding removal that would define American Indian policy for the remainder of the century. The St. Vrain massacre remains a potent historical lesson on the fragility of peace, the lethal consequences of cultural misinterpretation, and the personal costs paid by those who attempt to stand in the chaotic space between warring nations. The grave at Kellogg's Grove holds not just the remains of a federal agent, but the remnants of a diplomatic philosophy that perished alongside him on that May morning in 1832.